Okay, well, we might as well kick off on time. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much to everyone joining us today. This is the first Lawyers for Climate Action NZ webinar. So we're very excited about testing this great way of communicating and connecting with our members. We've had a great response. I think over 70 people have registered to attend, and it looks like there's a good number online already. So we're really thrilled with the response so far, and I hope you'll find it a rewarding use of your lunch hour. We have here today on the panel 3 members of our committee, me, James Every Palmer, and Michael Sharp. Between us, we have spent the last few weeks working hard on understanding the Climate Change Commission's draft advice. And we have had several discussions with members of Commission staff who've been extremely helpful and open in dealing with us to try and help us to understand the analysis they've provided. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the framework, what the advice covers, and what the statutory framework is. Then James is going to run through the detail on the analysis that sits behind the budget figures and the NDC figures that the Commission is proposing. And then Michael is going to make some comments at the end on some issues to do with the NDC and international credits. So just briefly, some housekeeping first of all. So we've got the Q&A function enabled on the webinar. So if anyone has questions as they're going along, the best way to do that is to try and bring up the Q&A function on your screen and simply type in a question. The panelists, probably mainly me while James is talking, will keep an eye on those. And if there's things where we think it would be helpful to address them as we go, we'll do that. But we'll try probably to leave most of them till the end because we have quite a lot to get through, but we'll certainly try to get to your questions. Likewise, this is a really great opportunity for us to get your comments on the Commission's report that we can incorporate into the submission we're preparing. So please feel free to use the Q&A function for leaving comments as well. But if you could identify them as comments rather than questions, that would be really helpful. I should also let everyone know that the webinar is being recorded. We will be making a recording available on our website, hopefully either later today or tomorrow if people have to leave early, or if you know of other people who are interested who weren't able to make it, then you should be able to find that. I think that's it for housekeeping. So I'll move on to sort of talking a little bit, first of all, about what the draft Climate Change Commission advice covers. There's really 3 elements to it. The first is that it provides advice to the Minister on what New Zealand's first 3 emission budgets under the Climate Change Response Act should be. So those cover the initial period of 2022 to 25, and then 2 subsequent 5-year periods. The second thing that the advice covers is the Commission's advice to the government on the policy direction to meet those budgets. So there's essentially high-level strategic advice on the types of policies that the government should be putting in place to enable the budgets to be met. And the third thing it covers is a review of New Zealand's current NDC, being the nationally determined contribution New Zealand has put forward under the Paris Agreement. Now, the government acknowledged last year that New Zealand's existing NDC, which is to reduce emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, is not adequate and doesn't meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. Rather than change the NDC right away, the government chose to refer it to the Climate Change Commission to provide advice on what a new NDC should look like. And that's the third element of the draft advice that's out for the moment. So as I'm sure you already know, the advice that the Commission has put out, or the report the Commission's put out a few weeks ago, is its draft advice. So it's going through the consultation process at the moment. Instead, it's open to review elements of that advice depending on the feedback. As we'll come to, at the moment, it looks very much as though our submission will certainly be recommending some quite significant changes to the advice. So we'll find out in due course you know, how the Commission responds to the feedback it's going to get, because I think some of it will be pretty substantive. In response to the feedback so far, the Commission has agreed to extend the deadline for submissions. So it was originally the 14th of March. It's now been pushed back to the 28th of March to allow people more time to analyse the material, and also in response to criticisms that not enough of the underlying workings and modelling has been provided. And we've certainly had some challenges in understanding some parts of the analysis, which is why it's taken us a little bit of time to be able to put together this presentation. So in terms generally of what we've chosen to focus on, we've focused very much in these comments, and likewise also in the submission that we're working on so far, on the 2021 to 2030 period. And the reason for that is because that is the most critical time period in terms of making sure that global warming is kept to no more than 1.5 degrees. We'll all be familiar with the IPCC's advice of a couple of years ago that really between now and 2030 is the window we have to radically cut emissions if we're going to be able to stay within that 1.5 degrees budget. So because of that, we've obviously looked most closely at the Zero Carbon Act budget figures for that initial period to 2030. And when you break down the relevant budgets into the time period, that amounts to a budget of 628. I'm going to get the unit wrong now, megatons of CO2 equivalents. And I think James can probably better place to explain than me what CO2 equivalents are, but essentially that applies a weighted figure to the various greenhouse gases and enables a sort of global figure for all greenhouse gases to be calculated based on their CO2 equivalency. So essentially their warming potential. Where the Commission gets to in terms of those budgets on domestic emissions, it's forecasting that our emissions at 2030 will be 52 megatons of CO2 equivalent, which equates to roughly 20% less than 2010. But as I say, James is going to go into those figures in a lot more detail. At a high level, comments on the report are what is great about it is that it would lead to meaningful reductions by 2030, which of course is a stark contrast to a complete lack of any reductions over the last 2 decades. So from where we sit now, the Commission's report, if it gets accepted, is definitely a step forward because it will see us at least moving in the right direction. The second thing is it really leaves behind any debate about whether we should be doing anything about global warming and shifts the discussion to how we do something about global warming. So that's really positive. There's also an emphasis on the importance of bipartisan support, which obviously would be a good thing if it's achievable. And we like the fact as well that it prioritises reducing gross emissions. So essentially bringing down emissions at source rather than focusing on removing emissions or compensating for emissions through forestry, which ultimately creates land use issues. And we also like the fact the report places an emphasis on planting native forests rather than plantation. But, and it's a big but, we do have a really big concern about whether the budget figures and the NDC are ambitious enough. Have they got the numbers right? Are the policies they're pursuing going to get us there? And that's where we do have some real concerns, which we're going to address. So before we get into the substance of those, just a word about the statutory purpose, because of course we're looking at this through our legal lens as lawyers, and so that seems the obvious place for us to start. And the first thing to note, of course, is that the Commission must act in accordance with the Act's purpose. That's obviously fundamental public law, and it's also helpfully explicitly required by Section 3, subsection 2 of the Act. Now, the Act's purpose provision is quite lengthy, but the first purpose of the Act, set out in Section 3, is to provide a framework to contribute to the global effort to limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So right there in the very first part of the purpose provision, we get the tie in to the 1.3 degrees goal. And then the second purpose is enabling New Zealand to meet its international obligations, including under the Paris Agreement. And of course, that again refers back to 1.5 degrees because that is the goal of the Paris Agreement. Now, if you go through the sort of operational provisions of the Act, there are a lot of other considerations the Commission has to take into account, particularly when it's setting the budgets. And these include things like economic impacts, distribution of impacts across generations, technical achievability, and various other things. So, of course, the Commission does have to take account of those other considerations because they are mandatory under the Act. But we say they don't outweigh the requirement to comply with the Act's purpose. And again, that really just comes back to basic principles of statutory interpretation. A statute has to be interpreted in accordance with its purpose. And there's nothing to suggest that any of those other considerations are intended to outweigh the overarching purposes of the Act. So as we say on the fourth bullet point there, our basic sort of framework that we are applying when we're thinking about what the Commission has to do and when reviewing this advice is that advice from the Commission which isn't consistent with these purposes of the Act would be unlawful in our view and at risk of judicial review. And again, I don't think there's anything particularly legally controversial about that view. That is just what the Act requires. Now, judicial review, of course, requires an issue to be justiciable, and that's clearly been accepted in relation to climate change issues. Here in New Zealand, we've had the Thompson versus the Minister for Climate Change Act, which established that the NDC was justiciable. And overseas, we've had plenty of examples of cases dealing with governments' stated budgets and reduction policies and holding them to be inadequate and requiring them to do better. So, so we certainly think this sits within a legal framework where there is scope for judicial review, although one would hope that wouldn't be necessary. So that's enough, I think, by way of introduction to statutory purpose. I'm going to hand over now to James to take us through the budgets. James.
Thanks, Jenny, and kia ora koutou. So, as Jenny set up with the statutory purpose, we see the budgets as being designed to fulfil New Zealand's obligations to help limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And to put that into a global context, I think a lot of you, or most of you, will be familiar with the IPCC's 2018 work looking at what had to happen in order to have a reasonable chance of limiting temperature change to 1.5 degrees. And the headline takeaway from that work is that by 2030, we should be 45% below our 2010 level of emissions. Now, unfortunately, since 2010, global emissions have been increasing. They were at 45 gigatons in 2010. By 2019, they're up to 60 gigatons. That's likely to drop a little bit in 2020 when those figures come out due to the response to COVID-19. But the end result is that over the next 9 years, so through to 2030, it's not a 45% reduction, now it's a 50% reduction plus, which is required in 9 years in order to get us back to having a reasonable chance to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. So in terms of New Zealand's share of that heavy lifting, the UNFCCC framework is based on common but differentiated contributions. So what that in essence means is that for a developed country like New Zealand, it's not enough to be doing the average, we have to be doing better than that. So against that, I guess we were expecting quite radical suggestions from the Climate Change Commission and quite radical transformation of the economy over the next 9 years. What we've seen instead is a relatively modest, great to see a turning of the curve so it starts heading downwards, but relatively modest reductions relative to 2010 emissions. And so we've spent most of our time trying to unpick that and to understand how the Commission got comfortable with that result. So there are a couple of different ways into that, but for example, they did quite detailed quantitative work on the NDC target and whether that was consistent with 1.5 degrees. And they said, well, our NDC can be no more than 564 megatons. But then that creates a bit of a discrepancy because the actual domestic budget emissions targets they set for that same period amount to 628 megatons. Also, they said quite correctly that 564 was based on global averages, and given New Zealand's position, we should try and do much more than that. But unfortunately, they didn't say what number that implied. So we've got 564 floating there in the sense that actually we should be doing much more than that, but not a corresponding number. And then we've also come across what seemed to be some maths problems with the number 564, which I'll turn to next. So in the context of all this, I guess, is trying to draw a balance between, on the one hand, liking what the Commission's doing in many ways, but also thinking, is it ambitious enough? So the first aspect there is whether 564 has been correctly calculated. And this gets quite detailed quite quickly, but I'm sure some of you are trying to keep across the details, so I will step through, although relatively quickly. So the Climate Change Commission uses what's called a split gas approach. So in working out budgets, they look at individual gases separately. So for one of the main gases, obviously CO2, what they said they were going to do is to take our 2030 net carbon dioxide, sorry, our 2010 net carbon dioxide figure, and then apply the IPCC's reduction ranges, so between a -40 and a -58% reduction to those 2010 levels to end up with our 2030 net CO2 target. And that's an important component of our overall 2030 target for all gases, which is the 52 million tonnes, and an overall component of our budget for that 10-year period. But the problem is that when the Commission did that calculation, the number that they put into the formula was not our net CO2 emissions, but it was our gross CO2 emissions for 2010. And you can see that in this table, which comes from Supplementary Chapter 10, that in the middle of the table, there's a figure of 34,958 kilotons, or 34.958 megatons. And that's not a net carbon dioxide figure, that's a gross carbon dioxide figure. So what difference does it make if we plug in the right number? Well, there are a couple of different ways you can calculate the right number, because there are a couple of different ways you can work out net emissions. I'm not going to go through that detail, but probably the one that we would favour is using the number that comes out of our greenhouse gas inventory, which is all the data set that MFE collects, which essentially measures the emissions that the sky sees from New Zealand. So it's our gross emissions, and then you take into account removals through forestry. And in 2010, our net CO2 emissions on that basis were 7 megatons, not the 35 which was used in the Commission's report. So if you plug those numbers in, then for all gases, our 2030 target would drop from 52 million to 38 million. And then our budget for that 10-year period would drop approximately from 564 to approximately 500 megatons over that period. So a relatively significant change due to that, what we think is an error in their approach. We've tried to understand why the Commission took that approach. And it seems that it's a spillover from the use of gross net accounting. That's terminology that I think many of you will have come across. What does it mean? Well, our NDC that we communicate to Paris and internationally is expressed as a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now that's what it says. The way it's interpreted by officials is somewhat different. It's interpreted as being a commitment to reduce our net greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005 levels of gross greenhouse gas emissions, and to do that by 2030. So what that means is that when we take the number that we subtract 30% from, we don't take forestry into account, we just take into account our gross emissions. But then when we work out whether we've met that target, whether we've achieve that number, we do take into account forestry. And we certainly think that that means that the headline numbers from our NDC overstate our level of ambition. And as you can see from the chart on the next slide, this shows our gross emissions and compares it with our net emissions, that year on year, roughly, our net emissions are already 30% beneath our gross emissions. So when we say that by 2030, our net emissions will be 30% below our 2005 gross emissions level, we're basically saying that our net emissions will stay about the same. So for us, having a 30% figure in the headline and not mentioning net or gross is not a fair and accurate way of reporting our level of ambition. Now, officials that we've, sorry, just back on that slide, Jenny, officials that we've talked to take a different view on that in terms of how we express our target. Their basic point is that, well, net emissions include forestry removals, and new plantation forests deliver removals only for the first couple of decades from their existence. After that time, you'd release carbon when you cut them down, and if you replant plantation forest, then they continue to remove it. But the real difference is only made in those first couple of decades. So their concern is that if we lock that into our base numbers for the purpose of determining a target, that would be forever committing to planting new forests. We say, well, actually, if we're going to count it in our what we measure, we should include it in our base year. It doesn't commit us to planting new forests. It just commits us to either doing that or finding alternative ways to get our net number down. But the key point here is that wherever you land on how we express our targets, we still think it's a mathematical error to plug a gross CO2 figure into that formula, because the percentage reductions that we're using are reductions on net CO2. So it's just apples and oranges if you plug the number in. So that's issue one. Then issue two, in terms of what the numbers should be, how do we go from 564 or 500, if you correct that mathematical error, to our fair share? Now that's a complicated issue, and it involves questions of what our responsibility is for past emissions, what our per capita share is of the remaining global budget, and what our capability relative to other countries is to reduce our emissions. The Commission doesn't go into that in any detail. It raises those issues and says that we should make significantly deeper reductions than the global average. They refer to Oxfam's 2020 analysis, which said, look, our fair share, taking into account those above factors, would really be a massive reduction compared to our 1990 or compared to any other level of emission reductions. So in contrast to the kind of levels that Oxfam are talking about, the 564 equates to a 35% reduction from 2005 levels. So there certainly seems to be a very reasonable argument that if we took seriously our fair share and our highest possible level of ambition, which is the wording from Paris, then we'd end up with a number that is well beneath the 500, 564 kind of budgets that we're talking about. It could be as low as being in the 200 or 300 of megatons of emissions over that 10-year period. But somewhat frustratingly, the Commission doesn't express an opinion on it, and will certainly be encouraging them to do that. One of the complexities of the New Zealand situation is that we have quite a unique emissions profile, where approximately half of our emissions, when measured in CO2 equivalents, come from methane. And the idea there is that although tonne by tonne, the methane emissions are much lower than CO2, because methane has a very high impact, a much higher impact than CO2 in terms of short-term temperature rises, it's given a higher weighting in what's called the GWP 100, where it gets, each tonne of methane gets multiplied by 25 to be turned into a CO2 equivalent. Now, every country is different, but most countries would have 5 or 10% of their emissions from methane on that basis, but New Zealand has half of its emissions from methane on that CO2 equivalent basis because of our agricultural sector and the production of methane in that. So how that affects us in terms of our budget is that the Commission looks at methane and CO2 and a couple of other gases separately. It then draws on the IPCC's predictions for methane, which are much lower levels of reduction by 2030 than in CO2. And then it applies that to our methane emissions. It then applies the CO2 numbers to the CO2 emissions, and then it combines them all together to have an all gases number. And in simple terms, that means you've got half of our emissions being subject to a 20% reduction and half being subject to a 50% reduction, so that overall you end up with a middling kind of 35% level of reductions on these simple figures. So we're not against that approach as long as we're all clear about what we're doing, and indeed the IPCC uses a split gas approach, and our Act builds in a split gas approach by having separate targets for methane. But we do have concerns about the way it's been implemented. In particular, the Commission treats that IPCC range, -11 to -30%, as if it has a normative force, as if it is what we should be doing, whereas it was really just the best estimate by the IPCC based on many, many different scenarios as to what might happen globally. It wasn't about what we should do, but about what was likely to happen over that period of time. And secondly, I've talked about that 25 times multiplier, but the problem with that is that it seems to underweight the impact that methane will have on global temperatures over the next 3 decades. And you can see that in the next slide and a couple of graphs which are taken from the Commission's draft advice. Here you can see on the left the global warming effect of a ton of methane versus a ton of carbon dioxide, and you can see that methane has a much bigger effect, although it becomes not much bigger than CO2 over time, even though it's bigger in the short term. And then on the right, you can see for our 2016 emissions, which were 1.3 million tonnes of methane and 34.5 million tonnes of CO2, that the way that plays out is that in the short term, the methane, and short term is 30 or 40 years here, has a bigger impact on warming than the carbon dioxide, but then that drops well beneath the level of carbon dioxide warming, and whereas the carbon dioxide doesn't have that initial hit on temperatures, but it continues to last for pretty much forever. So the way that the 25 times multiplier works is to say that in CO2 equivalents, basically that green line and that blue line, it just so happens that there's about a 25 times difference in terms of what New Zealand's outputs happen to be at that time, are about equivalent. And that's really a kind of a slightly odd average between methane having a much bigger impact on the short term and a much smaller impact on the long term. And so if you were just trying to do a rough approximation, then 25 times might be okay. But if you were really concerned about impact on peak global temperatures over the next 3 or 4 decades, then you might say that our methane level of methane production creates a special responsibility to either get methane down more or to take even more stringent measures on CO2 in the very short term. So that's a look at whether 564 is the right number or whether there's an arithmetic error. It's a look at what our fair share might be, including by taking into account methane. And so you, taking a 1.5 degree approach, you'd be at a number, we'd say, well below 564, but we'd also say actually 564 is the wrong starting point. You should start at 500. And it's not merely well below, it's really well below 564 or 500. Then in terms of the statutory purpose, we think that the purpose of the budgets, including over the next 10 years, is to meet that statutory purpose of doing our share for 1.5 degrees. So we think in simple terms that the number that you get from that that process of looking at 1.5 degrees is a cap on our Zero Carbon Act budgets, whereas what we've done is set a budget at 628. And what we're also concerned about is the way that the 628 was arrived at, where the Commission hasn't started with a number like 500 and said, how can we do it? How much would it cost? It hasn't sweated it in that way. Rather, it seems to have said, well, here are the policy proposals that people have talked about. Here's what the Productivity Commission suggested. These seem sensible and they don't seem to cause too much disruption. So it feels like a steady as she goes type approach rather than really setting out to achieve the statutory purpose. And while we can, I think, understand and have some sympathy with that in terms of not alienating sectors and in terms of generating bipartisan support and in terms of at least getting some progress happening rather than getting, rather than creating a huge amount of debate about what the budgets are. We are also at the same time deeply concerned about the lack of ambition and also feel that in some ways the Climate Change Commission is trying too hard to do the politician's job. It's one thing if the politicians say, look, here's what the science said, we should be at 400, but we just can't do that, so we're going to set a target of 500 or 600. But it seems that the Commission has taken it upon itself to make some of those compromises, or at least that's one way of reading it. So there's quite a bit of work that takes you to get to this point, but the combination of the statutory purpose and then that detailed analysis of what 1.5 degrees requires is what takes us to this part. Then very quickly in terms of the policy direction which has been proposed and our concerns about that, it's hard for us to second guess the modelling, we can't really, but we are a bit concerned that there's limited analysis of the detail of the regulatory changes required or the time path for those changes. There's a lot that's required for each of their policy proposals, for example, in relation to electric vehicles and increasing cycling, reducing methane emissions and stock levels on farms. And a lot of that requires cooperation and coordination of many levels of government. And it all feels a little bit hand-waving for things that have to happen very quickly in order to achieve the budget targets over the next 9 years. In relation to the ETS in particular, we have, I guess, seen a carbon price as being particularly useful in terms of driving behavioural change throughout the whole economy. So we've supported reform to the ETS or alternatively scrapping it and introducing a carbon tax, whereas the Commission seems to have come out more in favour of specific policy interventions in multiple areas rather than relying on an economy-wide price on carbon. There's reasonable people could disagree between those two approaches, but the risk with the multiple specific policy choices is that you're embarking on lots and lots of individual reforms. And for those of us who worked in the regulatory area, there is nothing more certain than unintended consequences from specific interventions. So there's a lot that they have to do to get right in order for that approach to work. Also in relation to the ETS, there is discussion about market governance and some issues to do with it, but no suggestions to tackle some of the major problems. For example, 60% of our emissions are through agriculture. Agriculture is outside the ETS. Not only that, but there's no linkage. So if we have a blowout in agricultural emissions, if they don't meet their projected reductions, we don't compensate through the ETS to squeeze other areas of the sector. It's just nothing happens. We also, compared to the level of units that we want to make available for auction to control the level of emissions on the covered sectors, we have a stockpile of existing units, which is over 10 times as big as that annual level that we want to auction off. So it's very hard to have an effective cap when that stockpile can be used, when people can redeem those or sell them to be redeemed by other people at any time. Finally, in terms of the policy direction, one thing we do agree with is that it's very important that we set expected targets for each of the policy interventions and then monitor whether they work, because if there are problems, if they don't deliver, then we need to know that as quickly as possible. Thanks, Jenny. Michael, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, James. Kia ora koutou. Can I just first support some of the comments that James has made, especially about the lack of underlying data and behind a lot of this report. We're mere lawyers, not mathematicians or statisticians or economists, but it's taken some time to dig down to find out what is the underlying basis for some of their figures and stats. So for a public consultation document, that wasn't ideal. Now, I'm just going to talk briefly at the end here about an issue, which is important, because in the end, this is how things are seen as all tying together. So if you look at the advice to the government, the Commission's report is that, okay, there's a gap between what they say the budgets are, 21-2030, 628, and then what they say is a 1.5 degree compliant budget over that period, 564. But in their view, that's not an issue because we can just bridge that by purchasing overseas credits. Now, they don't go into any detail about the mechanism for that. What they do comment is that the government does have to make more planning about how they're going to do it and budget it and things. But the mechanism for that is under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and that allows parties to the agreement to agree on certain mechanisms which, amongst other things, allow overseas credits to be purchased. Now, that hasn't been agreed yet. It's highly controversial for the reason that we're looking at here, that it potentially just allows parties to not exercise maximum ambition themselves in cuts in emissions, but buy credits from overseas. And everyone's had a bad experience of that under the Kyoto Agreement, where there's a lot of cheap and unverified credits which allow people to meet their emission targets, including New Zealand. So the issue that really has got to be addressed here along the line before any final recommendations or the government does anything is what's going to be agreed under Article 6. Now, from what I've been able to understand, there's only a relatively small amount of countries who have indicated in the indices that they want access to overseas credits. For the research that I did, there's only about 6 countries, including New Zealand. Now, New Zealand's NDC says something like that they want unrestricted access to overseas markets, but the indications from my research is that what's being discussed is that there will be restrictions on access to overseas markets, which in some schools of thought similar to the restrictive criteria under Section 5Z for budgets. So under the Act, as you know, budgets have to be met by domestic mitigation unless unforeseen circumstances arise. And there's also discussions how any overseas credits have to actually add to global reductions in emissions, not just transfer them from one country to another. So I'm just flagging that although not detailed in the Commission's report, there's a lot of uncertainties and a lot of things to be agreed or disagreed before New Zealand can have unrestricted access to overseas credits if they, as I said in the NDC. And I guess also what really has to be looked at if you step back and look at the issues and the legislation is that the legislation, as Jenny said at the start, has an objective to be compliant with the 1.5 degree objectives. The budgets fall under the Act, of course. So there is an argument that the budgets should be 1.5 degree compliant. The NDC is outside the legislation. It's set up. It's a matter. It's a treaty commitment by the government to not honor the legislation. So there are arguments that it's not as simple as the Commission is saying, and that okay, if our budgets aren't ambitious enough, we'll just go and buy some credits from overseas. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, just on that, interestingly, I think because the Commission is providing its advice on the NDC, it's a function it's performing under the Act. So I think it is still required to comply with the purpose of the Act and its advice on the NDC. But in any case, it's circular because you would hope that the advice on the NDC would be compliant with the Paris Agreement. It would be odd if it wasn't. Okay, well, thank you very much, James and Michael. We've had a few really good questions. So perhaps if I just run through some of those and throw them to James and Michael, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So the first couple of questions come from Thomas, and they're essentially about the split gases approach and methane. I think it was partly addressed already by James's comments, but I think the bottom line really of the question is having regard to the impact of reducing methane emissions as the strongest short-term lever New Zealand has to reduce global warming. The impact of splitting them out puts farming into a preferential position relative to other industries. What is the legality of this? So that's a big question. I'm not sure we can entirely answer the legality issue, but James, did you have any further comment on that?
Sure. Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Thomas, for the question. So completely agree with the warming potential from methane, and I see Paul Winton's added to the comments that the GWP20, the global warming potential in 20 years' time, as opposed to the GWP100, which gives the 25 times multiplier, has an 85 times multiplier for methane. So looked at over that 20-year period, 1 tonne of methane is 85 times worse in terms of temperature rise than 1 tonne of CO2. So given that, I think that there's a special onus in terms of either dealing with methane or taking greater steps for non-methane gases to offset our methane production. In terms of the legality of the split treatment, well, I think that that's just been a political deal to keep agriculture out. So historically, and now it's outside the ETS, and then in the way that the net zero by 2050 target was set, that's a net zero for everything apart from methane, with specific numbers in for methane, and that, to be fair, is not dissimilar to the way the IPCC treats it in their 1.5 degree analysis, where they accept that methane's actually hard to get to zero, so it probably won't. But it would. Yeah, no, I think that's all I've got to say on that. So hard to say it's unlawful under New Zealand domestic law, but yes, from a policy perspective, I think the Climate Change Commission could do more, could do harder thinking about the impact of our methane over the next 3 or 4 decades.
Yeah, thanks, James. So moving on to a different topic, we've got a question from Tom, going back to the mathematical error you talked about, James. Do you think that this budget accounting issue is a legal error, i.e. not just a policy difference? Should we make that argument in the submission?
I'm not 100% clear on what Tom's got in mind by the budget accounting issue, whether it's the mathematical error or not. Maybe, Tom, do you mind just sending in a clarification as to what this budget accounting issue is referring to?
Okay, should we come back to that one then? Next, we had a comment from Paul, but I think we've probably covered that. So I'll move on to an anonymous question. Are there apparent gaps in CCC recommendations due to time pressures to produce the report, or is it unwilling to offer radical targets and solutions? My concern is that some target reduction will become set in stone as the target.
Yeah. I'm happy to kick off on that, Jenny. I mean, I don't know that we can tell because we haven't been in the room, but I suspect that it's the latter, i.e. being unwilling to offer radical targets and solutions. So what I would speculate has happened is that you've had the NDC group of people who have worked quite hard to work out what 1.5 degrees requires, and they've come up with a number. And then you've had the setting the emissions budgets people who have focused on the art of the achievable. And then it was perhaps only at late stages where they realized that, oh, these are different numbers. They have a page or two in the report which explains that, well, we can do more in the NDC space because that includes the international offsets that Michael talked about, whereas our zero carbon act budgets are domestic only. What we think, based on the statutory purpose, that should have led them to do is to say, well, hang on, we can't have this gap. Actually, our domestic budgets have to meet 1.5 degrees as well. So they need to come down from 628 to 564 or to 500 or to 400, whatever the correct number is. How do we make that happen? So, yeah, so I mean, I'm just reading tea leaves to try and imagine what happened inside the commission, but that's what it feels like. And I think perhaps part of the explanation for that approach to the 6 to 8 was a desire to have a palatable number rather than one that was seen as being radical. But you know, for me, it feels like we're actually we've been for a while at the time when radical action is well and truly called for. And so yeah. I certainly share the same concern that some target reduction will become set in stone as their target. Although, I mean, I've heard in the UK that, you know, in some ways the hardest reductions to make were the first ones. In some ways they were low-hanging fruit because they could go from reduce their reliance on coal, but actually just getting the bureaucratic mindset changing towards reducing targets was a very big step. And so I'm torn between being delighted that we will actually have lower emissions in 2030 than in 2020, but torn between that and being appalled that it's going to be a modest reduction rather than a major one.
I guess I think it's unlikely that the target reductions, to the extent that we're right, that they're not adequate, I think it's unlikely that they'll be set in stone for very long, because I think they'll just come under so much challenge and they'll very quickly be seen as unacceptable. But I think starting with the wrong targets in the first place is unhelpful because, of course, it just means that people aren't setting the right expectations. And the risk is that we just waste time and we're sending confusing signals to people. So it'd be much better to start with the right targets.
And on that, Jenny, I mean, there's a real risk that we will become an international outlier in terms of developed countries. So rather than being, I mean, I think we're perceived at the moment as, or until recently perceived as being doing our fair share. I think that if our budgets are based on these numbers, we won't. Our stats will look very bad, and we're at risk of being put into the not trying hard enough category, which presumably in the decades that come will have trade and other consequences.
Exactly right.
Can I also say one of the big risks that I see is not so much the figures, it's the approach, and especially the approach in calculating 1.5 degree consistency. So, you know, the approach they've taken of gross net accounting and Kyoto forest accounting is significantly different than what the IPC had in their calculations. So So it's, I think an important thing is to not embed that into people's mindsets, because then that'll be used for, you know, calculating targets going forward.
Great. So we've had a clarification from Tom that he is referring to the 564 mathematical error, and saying, you quote officials arguing some of it is explainable through how they view forestry, ? So I think the question is essentially, do we see that as being the type of legal or factual error that would be reviewable, that might essentially create a problem with the validity of the Commission's decision making? I think that's
thanks, Tom. That's a really good question. So firstly, in our engagement with the Commission, which has been really good, we couldn't have asked for a better level of access and engagement. And it's all been on a without prejudice basis, in the sense that we've said, look, we're not trying to hold you to anything you say or trying to trick you into making any statements, because we really value the open exchange. But they've indicated that they've got an open mind on this issue, and that they can see the strength of the mathematical error argument, where they're doing an apples reduction to an oranges number. But if in their final decision they don't take that on board, if they continue with what they did in the draft and come up with a forestry explanation, then I think we'll have a threshold issue if we did try and review it with the court, as to whether that's just a nonsense characterization and it is just a maths problem. And if we got through that, then I think we'd win, because it would just be a maths issue. Look, I mean, it's as to whether we get through that threshold issue, the way that they've explained it in their draft advice to the government, you know, doesn't really make sense. It depends. If they maintain that approach and come up with better reasons, then they might be able to judicially review proof it. But at the moment, I think it would be a goer.
Okay, great. Now we've got a few more questions to get through. I'm mindful we've sort of getting towards the end of our hour, but we'll just, I think, assuming James and Michael are happy to, we'll keep going for a little bit and try and get to all the questions for those who are able to stick around. So the next question, I think this is probably more of a comment, but it's an interesting comment. So from Robert: the budgets feed into the ETS. If lower budgets are set and the ETS works, then they will be achieved. The CCC or the government cannot know for sure what level of disruption or innovation would result. The important thing would be to monitor and react closely so we can learn. So I think really that's sort of a comment on the ability of the ETS to operate as intended. I tend to agree that if it does operate as intended, that should be what happens. But I think for the reasons James highlighted, if briefly we've got concerns that it isn't actually able to work as intended. James, do you want to comment more on that?
Sure. So in simple terms, the ETS, well, in simple terms, the idea is we'll have 60 to 70 million tonnes of emissions over the next couple of years. Now, if we had a comprehensive and functional ETS, then whatever the cap number would be, that would be how many units we made available. That would be all anyone could emit, because they would be under pecuniary penalties if they didn't. So they would ensure that their emissions were limited in aggregate to the number of units available. So completely agree if we had a functional ETS. But of course, the problem is that firstly, agriculture, 60% of our emissions are not covered by the ETS. So if those emissions are larger than are currently budgeted, there's no, it doesn't flow through to a reduction in ETS available units. So we blow our budget by whatever we miss in that agricultural space. But it's even worse than that, because although the government has tried to work out through the ETS scheme how many units it will auction each year for the 40% of our emissions which are covered by the scheme, it does that assuming that a certain number of the existing stockpile will come to market and be redeemed in particular years. But that's just an assumption. So if there are more emissions than we've set in our NDC budgets, sorry, in our zero carbonate budgets, those people will just buy stockpile units on the secondary market and redeem them. So, and that we've got about 120 or 130 million units stockpiled. That's a very large multiple of the number of units which are going to be auctioned each year. So yes, if we had a functional ETS, then it would all work, but we don't. And it's quite a big job to reform it or to get rid of the stockpile and to get agriculture in. It would be huge political issues.
Yeah. Okay. So next question from Sophie, a question for James. Did the Commission advice consider the option of implementing ETS reform or a carbon tax? I.e., was it considered and disregarded in favour of specific policy interventions?
No, so in some countries, and I think in the United States, for example, I think there's been quite an expressed debate about the pros and cons of specific policy interventions versus a generalised price signal. But not really for the Commission, and what they say on it is a bit hard to understand for something which is so important. So they do talk in page 105 of the report, for example, about the importance of pricing of emissions to influence investments and choices. So they have as one of their pillars of how the policy direction should work, the idea of a price signal. But on the other hand, they, although they do make some recommendations in relation to the ETS, they don't address agriculture or the stockpiles, so they don't, their changes would make it better, but it wouldn't make it a functional cap. And then, so they seem a little bit half-hearted about the ETS, although I understand that there'll be future work done on it over the next year or so. And then when they come to recommendations, it's very much in the specific policy interventions category. So it's really, there's no philosophical discussion about those two broad choices. They seem to have, in different parts of the report, gone in slightly different directions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the general sense I've had, I think we've all had for the last few years, is there's been so much investment in the ETS, there's a reluctance to now look again at the overall architecture and think more broadly, but it's a shame because in many ways it would be nice to start again anyway. Question from Chris. How does the divergence on use of gross net numbers and setting targets compare with comparable reports overseas? Michael, is that something I think you kind of commented on that briefly.
Yes, there were two aspects of that. So there's gross net accounting is technically referred to when you account for forestry. So you ignore the base year and you just account for the growth in forestry. But what the Commission is referring in gross net accounting is you from the target. So you take a gross target and then you to a target, a gross base year, then a net target. So not from what I'm about to see, there's not many, or if any, other countries who are taking that approach. I think Russia is a possibility, but yeah, but it's certainly not common.
Okay, thank you. Now, just skipping ahead a little bit, there's a comment back from Robert, I think, commenting on our earlier answer to his question about the ETS, the relationship between the ETS and the budgets, he's saying that the Commission doesn't need to provide a guarantee that their suggested policies will meet the budgets. I think that's right, but clearly that must be the intention. But yes, I guess it's entitled to suggest policies that think will, and then monitor whether they in fact do. So I'm not sure. James, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, that's correct. And I mean, the Commission's role here is more high-level policy direction, and government will come up with an emissions reductions plan. Yep. There will be a lot of trying and learning in the area. I guess one thing to be clear on though is we shouldn't expect the ETS to be doing heavy lifting, and in terms of the way it's currently structured.
Can I also say that the ETS is built into the government's current trajectory with current policy settings mentioned in the report, which have higher emissions than the Commission's budgets.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So we didn't have time in the scope of this session to get into how the Commission is calculating the reductions, but my understanding is that essentially they've calculated what current policy settings would achieve on their own, and then sort of calculated the differences that their policies would make in addition to that. So there's already some quite big built-in assumptions about what the existing policy is going to achieve on its own, which might or might not be right. So there's definitely some risk factor in there around achievability. Right, we've just got a couple of last questions, or rather one comment. So Thomas has come back and pointed out the 25 times multiplier for methane assumes that the methane emissions are a pulse, but we will continue emitting. Therefore, the factor 25 never applies. That sounds right. Is that right?
Yep. I think, I mean, the some people, the two charts that I had up before, some people interpret those, yeah, there you go, interprets, say the one on the right is saying that, look, even interpret that as saying, look, if you take a long-term view, methane's not such a big deal, and we can even have a continual stream of methane without it contributing towards temperature rises, because in the long term, it's you know, the methane comes and goes over the course of a century, so it becomes after a while a constant level of methane which is in the atmosphere. But I think what that type of explanation misses is that if we just stop methane completely, there would be a significant reduction in global temperatures, which I think is the point that you would make, Thomas, there. So, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite powerful when you look at those graphs, isn't it? Okay. So a question from Andrea. Which means our LCANZI's letter to the Commission, we wrote to them a couple of times before they put out their draft advice, pointed out the fact that using gross versus net was inconsistent and illogical. They know you could challenge them on this on court. Why did they not change it, do you think? Well, that is an excellent question, Andrea. Yeah. I don't think we can answer that really. It is speculation. They presumably don't agree with us. Can we add anything to that, James and Michael?
Can you go back? Oh, you go, Michael.
Yeah, so I'd only say that we did have, at first they were suggesting that gross net was in the NDC, in the counting approaches in the NDC. We went through them and it wasn't. So they accepted that, but they said that that's just the way we do it in New Zealand, to take out the distorting effects of a unusual base year. So, you know, in as far as legally challenging that, yeah, there's all sorts of permutations, but it's certainly not built into the NDC.
Yeah, and to be fair, actually, perhaps by way of clarification, I think our thinking has evolved since those initial letters, in the sense that we don't really have a problem with gross net conceptually as a way to analyse emissions. What we have a problem with, I think, or continue to have a problem with, is the way in which it's been used as inconsistently when you're setting a target. So if your starting point is gross and your end point is net, as James said, you're really not comparing apples and apples, and that's the concern we have. So there probably are some situations in which gross versus net makes perfect sense, but we just have a concern about the particular way in which it's being used.
Exactly, and the big issue is them using it to assess 1.5 degree consistency. That is the big issue.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then last question from Michael. The Commission is focused on using validated and currently available technology to reach its budgets, but at the same time is relying on buying overseas credits under a system that has not been agreed and might be too restrictive. Is this consistent? Does anyone want to have a go at that?
So I did the content. Is it consistent with the Act? Well, it's there's the point that we made is there's a hole in their reasoning or how we get there, and we are saying there is some inconsistency with the Act in that, you know, we're saying the budget should be 1.5 degree consistent.
I think perhaps also the question, and it may be driving it, is there a logical inconsistency between those different approaches? And I think, you know, they're slightly different things, but there are a few. It's perhaps one example of there are a few areas where the report does seem to be logically a little bit inconsistent on certain things, and that may or may not reflect what James was suggesting, that possibly we've had, because of pressure of time, the Commission has had different groups working on different areas, and then it's all been brought together into one report. And so there are some places where the logic and the framework doesn't mesh particularly well, and I think that's possibly one. Another one is, of course, the Commission takes quite a principled view that we shouldn't be relying on technologies that are not yet proven and available in calculating how we meet targets, and I think that's a very sensible and prudent decision. But at the same time, it's relying on IPCC scenarios for achieving 1.5 degree consistency, a lot of which rely on large-scale carbon capture and storage, which is not yet available. So there are a few of these little inconsistencies, I think, throughout the analysis. Any other comments on that one? Okay. So that brings us to the end of the questions, and we've more than used up our time. As I said at the beginning, the webinar has been recorded, hopefully. So assuming that's gone according to plan, we will make it available on our website. That will include the slideshow as part of the webinar, but if for any reason it doesn't, or if something's gone wrong, we will make the slides available separately. So happy for everybody to refer back to those, to think about them. Please do send through any more comments you might have after this session. I know it's been extremely dense on details and pretty dry, and kudos to James in particular for the many, many hours he has spent working on this to be able to summarise it for us so expertly. And thank you all so much for participating. It's been an incredible response, and I'm really delighted with the level of engagement. Fantastic questions, and great to have so many people so engaged in this. It's really so important, and we will be continuing to work hard on preparing our submission, and hopefully we'll be able to get that out to everybody soon. Please do think about making your own submission as well. So we're hoping to circulate our submission well in advance of the deadline, so that if you want to make your own submission, you can cross-refer to ours, pick parts out of it, say something completely different. But the more submissions the Commission receives that are urging them to take a really ambitious approach, the better. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, James. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, everybody. And please stay engaged. And thanks again for attending. Bye.